So I'm Alison Forbes, I'm the Crick's Equality, Diversity, Inclusion Manager, and I wanted to say a few things before I left. I leave next Thursday. Vanessa Sauls will take over. And so too will Vanessa McKean from the Institute of Cancer Research in mid-June. 2 Vanessas for the price of 1. No, 2 Vanessas for the price of 2. Okay. So I wanted to speak to you all today about how social class in the UK affects access to careers, particularly careers like scientific research. So if I'm going to talk about that, I first need to define social class in the UK, and I'm aware that we're a really international institute. So if you would call yourself British, or you've lived here for 10 years plus, can you just wave? And if you'd say that you are EU or rest of world, could you give me a wave? Okay, thank you. So here I'm going to speak particularly about social class in the UK and mainly England, drawing on my experience and some academic papers. The definition, we'd mainly think about money. So it's financial, but it's also educational and it's also social and cultural. So if we're talking about finance, you mostly think, what do people earn? Are you rich? The average salary in the UK is 35 grand. The average salary in London is 45 grand. It's more than your salary. It's whether you rent or own your house, if you have any hope of buying a house. So the biggest factor in whether you're a homeowner, the biggest indicator is whether your parents themselves were homeowners. That's from the Resolution Foundation. It's also whether you have debt, pensions, savings. Do your parents give you money, or are you your parents' pension plan? It's also a lot about education, which is the bulk of my talk, and we're a training institute. So it's things like whether you went to private school or state school, did you go to university? Not everybody does. Which one did you go to? Have you got a master's? Got a PhD? It's also a lot about cultural and social capital. So what is your accent like? What did your parents do? Who is in your personal network? What are your cultural references? And class is not a protected characteristic in the 2010 Equality Act. So as the EDI manager, I spent a lot of time training on that. There's 9 protected characteristics. You're protected legally from discrimination and harassment by those 9 characteristics. Class is not one of them. And yet it cuts across, and it's integral to many of our life experiences. And the way that class interrelates with all those other characteristics and ones that also aren't in the Equality Act is very complex and nuanced. So I can't get into the full details of intersectionality in this presentation, but I just want to put that up front. And there is a campaign by the British Psychological Society to add it to the Equality Act, to make it 10. So there's some discussions in this area. And I think it's also important that we talk about class, because to date we might talk about it implicitly. So we kind of tend to have a general feeling that Crick science researchers or academics in elite universities in the UK tend to be from privileged backgrounds, but it's not always very explicit in the way that other characteristics perhaps are. Okay. Class is difficult to measure and define. So someone's financial circumstances can change significantly over their life in different ways. Someone can drop their accent. Someone can change the networks they move in. And there's a lot of middle-class people in the research who self-describe as working class, even though they're from very advantaged situations, but their granddad was a miner, whatever. The Social Mobility Commission have developed a set of questions that they recommend for UK employers to use in recruitment and workforce analysis. So you can use these questions to look at bias in your recruitment and progression, or your pay gaps. And we don't currently use them, and it's not massively commonly used, unlike data capture on ethnicity and so on. The questions are, what was the occupation of your main household earner when you were 14? And by that measure, about 40% of the UK working age population would be called working class. What kind of school did you attend at secondary? About 7% of the UK went to a private school. Very specific to the UK, were you eligible for free school meals? And about 15% of state school pupils are. And did either of your parents complete university by the time you were 18? So half of the current graduates coming out in the UK are the first in their family to go to university. Okay. This is me. I think class is it can be quite sensitive, it's quite personal, it can make people feel quite vulnerable for lots of different reasons. So I think it's only fair that I just say a bit about what my background is and where I'm coming from on this. So the image is, if you were a left-wing Guardian reader in Britain in the 80s, you might have seen Posy Simmon's cartoons, and I've put that in because they are basically like drawings of my childhood. So if you want to know, you go read those. There's a couple in it, they have children, they have a big house in North London. The dad is a polytechnic lecturer like my dad, the mum is a mature student and part-time worker and has lots of kids like my mum. And there's lots of lentils, and there's lots of talking about Radio 4, and there's lots of agonising over Margaret Thatcher. So that was me. There's a great strip where one of the daughters in the 90s she's had enough and she's going to marry a rich conservative banker, and she says, I never want to eat another lentil for the rest of my life, which made me laugh. In preparing for this talk, I filled in a quiz on the BBC's Great British Class Calculator. It's now 10 years old, but you can do it if you're interested. And they looked at large data sets and they calculated 7 different social classes in Britain rather than the standard 3 that get talked about. And by that, I came out as established middle class, so 1 below elite, not a surprise to me. The most gregarious and second wealthiest of all groups, whether I feel wealthy or not. The description is, enjoys diverse cultural activities, yes. Went to university, yes. Comfortably off and secure, yes. So that's who I am. And here I want to speak about class through the lens of my personal CV. So these are badges and crests of places I've either been educated at or worked at. And here I want to really focus on the fact that advantage accumulates and disadvantage also accumulates, and success can breed success. So I like my job, I think I'm good at it. You can say what you think later. I've worked hard to build my career. It hasn't always been easy. I've experienced sexism, discrimination, toxic work environments. But I also am very aware there are loads of class background and ethnicity privileges that I've really carried through. And I'm fully aware there are a lot of people who would be just as good or better at my job, and it's just the luck of the draw and the way society is. So that's what I want to reflect on here. So you see the top 3 crests all have Latin mottos, which I just found amusing as I put it together. So if I was to talk, I said in my definition, there's finance, education and cultural capital. So if I'm talking about finance, I didn't have to move house, stayed in the same house my whole childhood. I went to university in 2000, and at that point the fees were £1,000. When I got my entry job at Kensington Palace as an education officer, I lived with my mum in Hackney, which meant I could take a low-paying but prestigious, good for CV long-term job at not a major kind of dent. Educational, I went to Latimer. This is a selective, would have been a grammar school in the old days, school in North London. It's 400 years old this year. It's not a private school, but it has a crest, a Latin motto, a ridiculous song, awful, that my friends like to sing. A lot of the students go to Oxford, Cambridge, Russell Group. So my advantage there was my mum knew what she wanted for us, and she coached me and prepped me and was very informed and said, you're going there and I'm getting you in, and was prepared for me to travel an hour to school to have that advantage. It was quite a complex experience, so I feel ambivalent about it, because I came out with A stars, it set me on a path, but I'm not sure it was wholly a positive experience for everyone. My best friend from that school, so one thing to note, I said it's 400 years old. It was founded by a rich benefactor, and he said, I'm going to pay for 8 poor boys of Edmonton to learn Latin and stuff. So when I went, there weren't very many poor boys from Edmonton. It was mostly the middle classes of North London, travelling quite far, doing entrance exams, blah, blah. My best friend from that time is from a working class background from Edmonton. Her dad is a painter and decorator. Her nan was our school dinner lady. And so her experience at Latimer, she felt, I would never have gone to Cambridge and then got the civil service job without having been there. But there's also some kind of ambiguities in the experience. I went to Bristol University. Paul is Chancellor of Bristol University. It's a prestigious university. A lot to say about class looking back at Bristol. Even though I see myself as a very privileged background, middle-class person, this was the first time in my life I met really posh people. And it was just quite a different experience. My memory of Bristol, I did politics, and this is 24 years ago, is that I remember very few what I would call working class students or students with strong accents, very few people who weren't from the southeast of England, for example. I can remember one mature student. You know, it was not a diverse experience. As I said, I worked at Kensington Palace. That's, you know, historic royal palaces. It's museum and heritage sector, which is a very hard to get into sector. That kind of badge got me a job at UCL, where I worked for 10 years. That badge of UCL got me a job here. But I don't think those badges tell you whether I'm a reliable colleague, intelligent, easy to work with. That's just the point I really want to press. Okay. This is Maggie Smith. In The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie. This is one of my mum's favourite films. She plays a very elitist school teacher at a girls' school in Edinburgh in the 1930s. And she's always recruiting girls for her small set. And she says in the film, I'm in the business of putting old heads on young shoulders, and all my pupils are the creme de la creme. And I've included that quote because it makes me think of my work at UCL and at the Crick. So UCL was always looking for the creme de la creme in its intake. The Crick is looking for the creme de la creme of global scientists. But how exactly do you define the creme de la creme, and how do you measure it fairly? Okay. I'm going to talk a lot about my time at UCL. So for 10 years, I worked in UCL WP UK UGR. It's a very hideous acronym for a team. They're now called the UCL Access Office. So if you don't think things get better, they do. So it's the UCL Widening Participation UK Undergraduate Recruitment Team. This is a Saturday school that I ran. I'm in the second row. It's very pixely, but you can see some really fab London GCSE students and some UCL students having a great time. So my job there was to work with non-selective London state schools, lower performing London state schools, and within those with students who were the first in family to go to university, with parents in non-professional, lower income type jobs. And I also worked across the country, but we mainly focused on London. And my job was to offer them academic enrichment, aspiration raising, career and university information, and help them apply to places like UCL and Oxford and Cambridge and so on. So in those 10 years, I had thousands of conversations with teenagers, parents, teachers, undergraduates, PhD students, and academics. And that's what I'll draw on a bit in this talk. And I would say, so I said it's widening participation, but it was also UK undergraduate recruitment. So maybe 90% of my time was on the schools I've just described, and maybe 5–10% of my time was on schools at the extreme opposite end of privilege in the UK. And it's one thing to know it intellectually from reading reports. But those 10 years really brought home to me there is not a level playing field at all in the UK education system. It's not meritocratic. There are some interventions and things to try and level things out, but they are not evenly reaching everyone. And there's a lot of talent being wasted in the UK. So that's my personal view, that I feel quite strongly from that work. And I think that organisations like the Crick, we can't solve that big picture, but we can develop well-structured interventions to give opportunities to talent that otherwise wouldn't flourish. Okay, so I'm going to speak more about education in the UK. There's 160 universities in the UK, and maybe 20% of the working age population have a degree from one of those. 24 of those universities are what are called Russell Group universities. So they might be called research intensive, highly selective, they're your more elite, whatever label you want to stick on them. And the Russell Group make up 6% of those 20% graduates. Within the Russell Group, you have OxBridge, Oxford and Cambridge, probably the most famous British universities and some of the most famous in the world. 1% of the UK working age population have gone there. And it'd be interesting to know what percentage of Crick staff or Crick research scientists went to various of these universities. Okay. And when we're thinking about the creme de la creme, the best, we might be thinking, well, the Crick is the best place in the world for biomedical research. Of course, we want the 1%. Of course, we want the cream off the top. And I just want to flag and pause. There's lots of reasons that an incredibly talented person might not go to Oxford, Cambridge, the equivalents, in whatever context. These are things that people told me or that I've read in accounts or heard on interviews. So things like teachers saying, that's not for you, kids from our school don't go there and we're not supporting your application. Or just not even thinking of it. Like, if it's not presented to you, why would you think of it? Or people who went on open days to places like Oxford, Cambridge and had a horrible time and just thought, no way am I spending 3 years with these people. Or family pressures. You can go to university, but you need to live at home. We can't afford it. You've got to commute to the local uni, which is whatever uni it is. You need very high grades to get into these universities. And the most disadvantaged schools have the fewest specialist teachers and the highest teacher turnover, for example. Okay. And if we're stepping away from university type and looking at private schools, so these are some statistics from the Sutton Trust Elitist Britain report in 2019. That's a think tank that looks at social mobility. So they are a bit obsessed with private schools and OxBridge. This report, they found that people who had either been to OxBridge or a private school have what they call a chokehold on the British elite. So between 20% to 65% of people in a really diverse range of occupations are from either private school or Oxbridge or both. And remember, only 7% of the UK population have been to a private school. But you can see at the far end, the judiciary, so our senior judges, 65% went to private schools. So civil service and politics are kind of at the really most high end. Medicine and law also come really, really high. But you can see academia and research science, maybe not as elitist by those measures, but certainly quite up there. So this is Fellows of the Royal Society or Fellows of the British Academy. 42% have been to private schools. That's about 10 years ago. And again, looking at undergraduate admissions at elite universities, the media have a big focus on Oxford, Cambridge, how many private schools every year from whichever angle they're going for. But often places like Durham or Bristol have actually been more elitist than those. So it's not necessarily just about Oxbridge. It's also worth pointing out, this is very binary. So it's not as simple as private school, very privileged, state school, goodness me, so disadvantaged. So I'm a state school student and I consider myself very advantaged. So if you go to a outstanding state school, look at the house prices around it, go and find a special measures or underperforming state school and look at the house prices around it, have a think about that. And also some private schools will offer scholarships or bursaries for low income families. It might not be a huge part of their intake, but there is that experience. And then moving to tuition fees. Is anyone a PhD student? Yeah, close to your heart maybe. Okay, so Tony Blair introduced tuition fees in the UK in 1998 at £1,000 a year for undergraduate. I went in between those two, so I went in 2000, so my degree cost £3,000. Just after I left, that tripled to £3,000 a year. And in 2012, while I worked at UCL, it tripled again to £9,000 a year, and then a little uptick in inflation. So if you are looking at England, we're really an outlier. So we have the most expensive public university fees in the world by that measure. So obviously America's famous for very expensive fees, but those are mostly private institutions, and their public institutions are not quite as expensive as us. So that's a high burden. Okay, so imagine you're thinking of a fairly typical English Crick PhD student who's perhaps coming in this autumn to start their PhD, and let's assume they went to somewhere like Bristol, and assume they took out the maintenance loan for someone away from London and away from home, and that they then did a one-year master's at one of the 5 Golden Triangle OxBridge institutions, which is our 3 partners, Oxford and Cambridge. So that's the average from this is research I did this week. So all those fees and that loan come to £74,000, which is a significant amount of money. So that might have been paid up front or taken out as loans, which are owed to be repaid in the long run. And that's not including living costs for the master's year, and your maintenance loan pretty much covers your rent and accommodation, not much else. So either way, it's a lot of money. And bearing in mind, what's the average UK salary I mentioned is 35k. So that's the context we're in. Okay. So I'm going to share some thoughts from my time at UCL. As I said, I worked with a lot of schools across the UK, and these are 2 schools that I happened to visit. So the top is Mary Erskine's in Edinburgh, and the bottom is Cumberland School in Newham. And you can see Mary Erskine's basically looks like Hogwarts. And the average, I may have said it previously, the average annual fees for a UK private school at present are £15,000 a year. So I visited a lot of these schools, and I just wanted to share what that experience is like of arriving at these kinds of places. So when I arrived at somewhere like Mary Erskine or Westminster School, you'd be greeted, checked in, offered coffee, kind of chatted up, pumped for information. You'd give a talk, you'd be looked after. We'd often have a sit-down lunch. They'd have a whole bunch of Russell groups in at the same time. And you'd be kind of pumped for nuggets of information over lunch by very informed people. And they'd say things like, so Alison, would you say that UCL discriminates against private school students at present? And how bad is it in medicine? And what was the number of applications per place last year? So they're very savvy. And then the London schools that I went to, like places like Tower Hamlets, Newham, Hackney, a lot of them brilliant schools, like very organised, dedicated teachers, fantastic young people, but often it was much more chaotic. So you'd arrive, who are you, who booked you in, what, she's on leave, she's sick. So there's more like teachers off with stress. It's more chaotic, and it's not as detailed an experience for those young people, and that's not their fault. I also want to touch on something called the London effect. So I don't really like this, I'm talking about inequality, but I don't want to present this sort of binary of like London state schools are awful. There's actually something called the London effect, which found that disadvantaged students on free school meals in London schools do much better than the rest of the country. So there's something going on in London schools that is doing well by those students. That's quite interesting. And it's complex why that is. So although I was very worried about the outcomes of the young people I worked with in London, I also felt they were relatively advantaged. And I was actually more worried about similar young people, free school meals in tiny towns, small cities, coastal towns, rural towns, disadvantaged places, left behind places, places that voted Brexit. you know, they are much more cut off. They don't have the transport connections. They might not have a lot of local universities. When we did those visits out to those places, you could see the kids were much less confident and savvy, whereas the London students, they might be very disadvantaged. They've got King's, Imperial, UCL, LSE all fighting over them, offering them summer schools. So, you know, it's more complex than it looks. There's Brampton Manor in Newham is another school we worked with. A couple of years ago, they made the papers because they sent more students to Oxford and Cambridge than Eton did that year. So that was quite interesting. But the fact that that was a massive news story shows you still how much inequality exists. It shouldn't be a huge surprise. Is anyone in the room a parent of someone under 20? Okay, so this is for you. Behave yourselves. So as I said, I work with lots of parents, and when I started that job, I wasn't a parent, so it made me reflect a lot. Most parents are really lovely, they're really kind, they're appreciative, they just want to support their kid, whatever their kind of background. A lot of them really respectful, they had great conversations. So I want to make some observations about a small subset that I will just call those parents, that I had enough interactions with that I was like, this is a sociological type that I am noting. By my observation, they were all middle, upper class, professional backgrounds. And I think, I just want to say it's natural to look after your own children and your own contacts. That's a human instinct, and everyone has that instinct, and it's not something to put down. And it's good to advocate for your child and support your child. But I think there's a point when you tip from advocating for your child into being an attack dog for your child. And I could see some quite nasty behaviours that I would describe as opportunity hoarding and like aggressively pushing, you know, if someone has something, that means that's not for my kid, so I'm going to be aggressive. So I'll give you a couple of examples of what I'm talking about. So maybe a few times a year, we would have a phone call or an email from a parent who had found our programs. They found our really great UCL impressive summer school that's going to be an amazing opportunity. And then they've read that it's only for poor kids. It's only for kids at these schools, not at private schools. It's only for kids whose parents haven't been to university. It's not for me and my kid. This is disgusting. So they would phone us up or email us and they would say, like, how can you defend this? How can this be legal? Rah, 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 rah. Who's paying for this? You're narrowing participation. You are not widening participation. By denying private school students the chance to go to this summer school, you're narrowing participation. And they would always say they were disgusted, and they would always sort of vaguely imply that they were going to get legal advice, and you just sort of deal with them. So that is a type. The other story I want to share is that we ran the UCL Open Day, which is a huge event with, you know, about 10,000 people, parents, kids, teachers. So we ticketed the event. It's free, but you had to have tickets to manage the queues. Tickets always sell out. And then everyone who didn't get a ticket, you just say, come at midday, you will get in. It's just how we manage the queue. Calm down. And one year we had a great email that I always remembered, which just said, dear team, I am a senior civil servant. My wife, who is a GP, has phoned your team several times for our daughter. She's not got a ticket, rah, rah, rah. Give us a ticket, basically, because of what we do for a living. So that's an example of what I'm talking about. And this type of behaviour is part of what Professor Lee Elliott Major calls an educational arms race that starts at birth. And who loses out in this arms race? It's not the middle classes. He's the first professor of social mobility in the UK, and he's at Exeter University. And although he has a brilliant surname, he's not actually from an upper class background. And what I reflected on in these conversations with parents and teachers is this kind of blind spot and what I would call a cognitive dissonance. So they would say, what you're doing, these programs at UCL or social mobility charity, whatever it might be, it's social engineering, which is not good. It's not fair because you're blocking people, and maybe it's illegal. How can you put on free programs for these people? How can you reserve work experience for just this group? It's not fair. How can you apply contextual admissions to university? How outrageous. And yet at the same time, there's this kind of huge blind spot that, what would you call a really fantastic experience at a private school, having a private tutor, having a private coach to help you apply for university, if not social engineering, if not fair. And how many of these young people were given work experience in the summer through their parents or their parents' friends? So nepotism comes from the Italian nipote, nephew, the Pope's nephews. Yeah. I had some work experience through a family friend, for example, at an architect's firm in Holborn. So there you go. So a lot of careers are hereditary. So this is a piece of work which I'll quote a lot later, the class ceiling. So this piece found that the children of doctors in the UK are 24 times more likely to become doctors. So it's hereditary, it's genetic. Lawyers, it's also quite hereditary. Film and TV, 12 times. So I was talking about this with a colleague and I said, and teachers breed teachers, don't they? She, yeah. Social workers breed social workers, yeah. And then she goes, what do estate agents breed? I love that. And then another one from America. So a Nature paper in 22 found that faculty in America, all subjects, 25 times more likely than the average person to have a parent who has a PhD. So your PhDs are also hereditary. And that doubled at your elite US universities, and it's been very stable. Okay. I want to talk about the teenagers I worked with. So these are some young people on a UCL summer school. One of them's got a jumper that says 98, and I think that's his birth date, and it's just awful. Just make sure. So my job working with these brilliant young people was to enrich their education. So I took quite a pride in going on these top private schools and looking at their programming and thinking, my program's as good as that, if not better. Yes, why not? Why shouldn't they have that? My job was not to assess their aptitude. So I'm not a teacher and I wasn't an admissions tutor. So I can't say, yes, they were all geniuses and they all deserved to get into places like the Crick. That wasn't my role. But what I can say is that they were really smart, they were very resilient, they were very tough, they were very creative, they were very tenacious, they were very innovative, not all of them, but most of them. So these were all qualities you would love to have in a PhD in your lab or in a colleague or in a direct report that you hired. They were very funny. They did really high quality caliber work on top of their schools. They were commuting in on a Saturday morning to UCL for like most of the year. They had debates on things like this house would assassinate a dictator. They did extra credit reports. They were incredible. And I saw lots of them progress to places like UCL, Oxford, Cambridge. And I knew how not easy that was because I spoke to them, I knew their families and their teachers. And I found the way we talked about these students was quite interesting in those 10 years at UCL. So there was a lot of what we would call deficit model discussion, especially early in those 10 years. So there's a lot of, but we're worried they won't thrive. They will need a lot of extra support. They will be an extra burden on the mentoring and transition program. Will they do well? A lot of assumptions like we need to raise their aspirations. They have low confidence. We need to raise their aspirations, which I always found weird because all these young people I spoke to were like, I want to be a this, that, the other. And their mum and dad were like, yeah, we want her to be a this, that, the other. When they came into the institution, I worked with them as undergraduates, so you hear about their experiences as someone from a council estate in South London, someone with a different kind of accent to everyone else in their seminar group, someone who has to have a part-time job when no one else on their course does. It was quite illuminating. So that's a bit about what they were like. Okay. So I want to talk about contextual admissions, if anyone has heard of that. This is something that a lot of universities have introduced within the past, say, 5 years. And I worked on UCL introducing a contextual admissions policy for its undergraduate UK applicants in about 2018. And I think pretty much all the UK Russell groups have some version of it. So think back again to your creme de la creme, creme. Something like maths at UCL might be entry requirements, A star, A star, A star, and some extras. So if you have 2 candidates applying, you see the 3 A stars, you see an A star, and a B, and you think, I'll take the 3 A's, thanks very much. And what that is, that high level line is not showing all the context below, further down. So one student might have come from a small class size in a school with stable teachers who have masters in their discipline, someone else coming from a class size of 23. I work with young people who said they'd had 3 maths teachers in their GCSE year change. People who said our physics teacher did biology and they don't really understand physics. It's not the teacher's fault. They need to work part-time jobs. They need to help with their brothers and sisters because their mum and dad are always working, or they don't need to work. They have their own nice quiet bedroom, they have a really good internet connection, or they don't. And that really came through in the pandemic. And again, parents we've touched on. So contextual admissions would say, given all that context, candidate B is as good and deserves as much of a chance as A. And so the basic premise might be UCL has a 3A course, and UCL will say, if you meet various criteria that we've decided, you don't need 3As, you can come in on A, B, B, for example. That's the basic premise. So the devil will be in the detail of how you measure and define that. And it's usually your postcode, running it through various deprivation measures, looking at your school, and then additional criteria. So the UCL one looks at whether you're a young carer, whether you're estranged from your family, or whether you've had any experience of the care system. Okay, that's Charlie and his golden ticket in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. And so you have this kind of narrative in this work, you know, this sort of wonderful moment. And I had a lot of these golden ticket moments. So it is really special when you have someone, a young person who's had a hard time or been to a not great school and they get that offer and it is life-changing. And I was lucky to have some moments like that. So I remember a young woman called Simone that I worked with from GCSE, you know, saw her all the way through. And then I knew she'd applied and I was really hoping she'd come here and not go to Oxford. I logged into our system on A-level results day and could see she'd got the grade. So I phoned her and was just like, it's Alison. She was like, rah! It's just the best. And she's like, I kept refreshing the screen on UCAS, I didn't believe it. And, you know, it's really wonderful when you have these moments. But the fact that it's such an emotional thing to talk about shows that it's still unusual. Okay. So it does help it gives someone more opportunities, it gives them more career progression and more pay, but it's more nuanced. So the class ceiling by Sam Friedman from the LSE and Daniel Lauriston is a really good detailed look at this. So they looked at pay and the social background of thousands of workers from an ONS data set. And that what they found is getting into elite professions like law, medicine, etc., accountancy. They also look at media. They don't look at academia, unfortunately, but it's probably similar in some ways. Getting in doesn't mean you progress as fast as your middle-class peers. So they found a nearly 16% class pay gap in these elite professions, and they were controlling by variables like qualifications, age, different variables. And they found that that class pay gap is compounded by different characteristics. So they're not saying gender doesn't matter, ethnicity doesn't matter. They're saying it all matters and it all compounds. And they found even OxBridge doesn't wipe it out. So there's still a pay gap between working class OxBridge and middle class OxBridge graduates. Okay. They looked at why this happens. So they went and did interviews in elite firms. And they, you know, as with all these things, it's always multifactorial and quite complex. So they had a whole chapter about the risk cushion of BOMAD. Does anyone know what that is? It's the bank of mum and dad. So I had a wealthy Bolivian flatmate once, and when he was like struggling, he'd say, I need to make a submission to the Fundación Garcia Morales. And I was like, what's that? And he's like, it's my mum and dad. It means you can take more risks. It means you can say, I'm going to take a fixed term contract because it's going to be a great thing on my CV, and then it might, you know, and if I've got 2 months without salary, it'll be all right. They also found you need sponsors, mentors, or advocates to help you navigate the labyrinth, which is a metaphor they used for the civil service in particular. And those are often informal rather than formal. And senior people who are in the position to be advocates, when they're prospecting for proteges, they're tending to be influenced by unconscious bias. So who do you have the most rapport with is often who you have something in common with, often a superficial thing that starts a conversation, or you just feel really comfortable because you're so similar to each other. So I call this, he reminds me of a young me. He's got something. They also found different attitudes to career management in working class and middle class professionals that I found quite interesting. So partly in working class professionals, a belief that I keep my head down, I work really hard and I prove my worth and I will be noticed and I will be valued. You know, I'll do 20 good things and I'll be noticed. Almost quite deferential or humble. Whereas in contrast, in more middle upper class people, they found, good attitude to work, but much more awareness of you've got to build your network, awareness of something called PI, which a colleague has spoken to me about, performance, image, and exposure. So performance, only a slice of the pie, big slice, image, big slice, exposure, how many people know your face. It's quite illuminating. Okay. Postgraduate qualifications are becoming a new frontier for social mobility. We're seeing credential inflation in a lot of careers. So jobs that maybe you didn't used to need a degree to become a nurse a long time ago, but now you do. Or you might see a master's is desirable for some entry-level graduate type job. There's no equivalent structure or investment in widening participation at postgraduate. The fees are much higher and they vary a lot more. You know, £9,000 is high, but it's fairly stable across the UK. There's no access agreement around postgraduate with the Office for Students, so they're not looking at what you're doing. There's no single application system like UCAS, so you can't get all the data and look at it easily. I found this story really illuminating. So this is Sue Black, OBE. If you don't know her, she's a professor of computer science at Durham, and she is the woman who saved Bletchley Park from falling into disrepair. And she left school at 16. She left a violent marriage with some small children, and she thought, I've got to sort out a career to support my kids. She did an access maths course. She went to London South Bank University, which is not in the Russell Group, and did computer science. And I found this fascinating. So to the end of her degree, her supervisor said, do you want to do a PhD? And she went, oh yeah. And then she said, and then I went to the library and looked up what a PhD was because I didn't want to tell him. And she thought, yeah, I do want to do that. And that just shows, if you don't know something, how can you know it's an option? I also find that story interesting because I remember working on mature students and BTECs and this type of stuff early days at UCL, and the attitude was quite like, well, we're not going to publish a list of which courses accept BTECs because we don't want to kind of encourage it and make it easy sort of attitude, like you had to look them all up. And we only take very few BTECs. And if it's a mature student, they should contact the officer and just discuss it and explain. And they might need to, all this kind of gatekeeping kind of stuff. It's moved on since then. But I just think Sue Black applying to UCL would not have got in. But South Bank took her and she then progressed. Okay, I want to speak about pay and elite careers. Okay, so this is a quote from an American librarian, and she's invented a concept called vocational awe. She's called Fobazi Ater. Do we have any librarians here from the Crick? Oh, okay. So this is her piece of writing, and we can exchange librarians for scientists. So assumptions librarians have that scientists have that science institutions are inherently good and sacred and beyond critique. Vocational or directly correlates to problems within science like burnout and low salary. Science institutes are just buildings. It's the people who do the work. You can't eat passion, you can't pay rent on passion. We need to stop treating vocational or as the only way to be a librarian, scientist, academic, journalist, documentary maker, actor, whatever you want to list. So this is what I call sparkly careers. So they not necessarily well paid, they may be badly paid. Museums and galleries are really badly paid. I used to work in them. They're worse paid than STEM. They're high prestige. So you have bad paying conditions at the far end. As you progress up, you might make it to the top and have decent pay and decent conditions, but they're high prestige, they're intellectually stimulating. If you're in the pub and someone says what you do, you say, I discover how life works. I'm curing cancer. And then they want to talk to you more. And I find that really interesting. And again, thinking of my friend from the working class background who I mentioned earlier from school. So she just said to me on this, she's like, if you're a working class kid and you're bright, you chase the money. Like she went into the civil service, brother went into banking. She's like, we want the money and you want the stability and you don't want the risk. And she said, I've had people say like, why didn't you go into publishing? Why didn't you do creative writing? Like you love literature. And she's just like, I can't do that. You know, I can't do that. This is another young woman I admire a lot. She's called Sophie Pender. She went to Bristol like me. She went 17 years later than me. Sadly, from her experience, I don't think things have changed very much. So she's your classic kind of golden ticket, widening participation, poster girl thing. So North London State School, quite difficult home life, poverty, all these sort of measures. And she got A stars and she got into law at Bristol and she became a solicitor in a law firm. And she's given a talk called How Becoming Socially Mobile. It's quite short. I really recommend that you watch it. And so she talks about, I've made it, but at what cost and what's that experience been like? And her experiences at Bristol as a first year led her to create a little Facebook group called the 93% Club. 93% who went to state schools. I'm proud that I went to a state school. Are you? And she was really surprised by the reaction and the huge uptake, and it spread across the country, and she's now founded a social mobility charity alongside her law job. She talks about it being a reverse Bullingdon Club, so doing for those kids what the Bullingdon Club was doing for David Cameron and Boris Johnson, etc. At her events, she does things like free headshots for young people, like networking lessons. And in her talk, she talks about arriving at university, being really excited, like, I'm going to wear a beret, we're going to read books, it's going to be great. But finding a lot of people coming up to her saying, what school did you go to? What school did you go to? And they don't mean the school that she went to. They mean, oh, my cousin went there. And they all kind of know each other already. And she says, I was called a chav. People laughed at the way I talk. People laughed at my clothes. I felt really self-conscious. Someone came up to my friend and I and said, my coat costs more than your houses do. And if you find that shocking, like it's upsetting, but I don't find it shocking. Like I can imagine that happening at Bristol when I was there, and I can imagine it happening now. Okay. So we're moving to, I'm going quite long. We're moving towards the end. I want to speak about accent bias, drawing on Sophie's experiences. And when you watch her talk, you'll notice she sounds quite middle class. So she's sort of shifted her accent. The central problem we're getting at here is that a lot of British people have a kind of bias, and we instinctively think that if you talk posh, you must be clever and you must be a good fit for a top job. I'm going to read a quote to you. This is by Darren McGarvey, who is a writer and broadcaster, and he comes from the East End of Glasgow. And I'd invite you to listen to him speaking after this talk and consider how, if you have a different sort of reaction to his speech than to my speech. He says, even when I think I'm speaking clearly and politely, the majority of people in the UK are making a value judgment about me based on my Glaswegian dialect. And there is nothing I can do about that unless I submit myself to the humiliation of elocution lessons. That's Darren. And that is Audrey Hepburn learning how to talk proper in My Fair Lady. This is the research by Queen Mary and Sutton Trust on accent bias in Britain. So they interviewed 3,500 people from university applicants up to professionals, and a diverse sample across the whole of the UK, representative national sample. And they found, I don't think anyone would be actually that surprised by the results. This is what they found. So they found that received pronunciation, which is how Rishi Sunak talks, David Attenborough talks, is how kind of upper class people on Radio 4 talk. My accent's probably close to that. I don't know if it's full on RP, but it's close to that. That was the most preferred, and about 10% of the UK population actually speak that as their natural accent. And quite a lot of our Crick colleagues have that accent, I would say. And they found that this sample of people from all different backgrounds rated the accents of what were perceived as working class speakers. So that might be multicultural London English, which is basically the English that a lot of the young people on my summer school would speak. Cockney, estuary English, which is around the Thames Valley. The accents from northern English industrial towns, Manchester, Liverpool, Newcastle, were assumed to be working class whether they were or not. And also ethnic minority groups. I think the accents were Indian and Caribbean. Those were rated lower for prestige, expertise and competence, even when responses were identical. So from the report, even with the same grammar, lexis, speaking style, a speaker with a Birmingham accent was judged to be less intelligent and less appropriate for a job as a university lecturer than a received pronunciation speaker. And they also found that bias is stable and it's stronger the older you are, and if you're from South England, and if you're more upper class yourself. And a lot of the students and the professionals had people make fun of the way they talk. Okay. So here are some university students talking about their accents. And so these are students who've done everything you might want them to do. So they've worked hard, they've got into a good university, and they're doing a STEM degree. So someone from Northern Ireland, I want to go into research. Even with a more posh accent, I will be hindered. My Scottish working class accent will not fit into medicine. Liverpool, I don't hear my accent when I watch videos of scientists. I don't hear my accent in the field. I won't be taken seriously. So they're thinking about their careers. And the positive of the study was they found it can be addressed. So even a small bit of training or a flag in recruitment to be aware of your own bias to accent can really reduce the outcomes, those biased outcomes. And they advised speakers to focus on confidence and public speaking, not on shifting their accent and fretting about their accent. And they noticed that positive shift in the younger generation where the bias was not as strong. Okay. So I'm coming towards the end, and I want to talk about the impact. So I've thrown a lot of information and ideas at you. And we could just say, well, so what? The Crick recruits the creme de la creme. If they happen to be quite privileged, we're just recruiting the best, and we're only doing what we can with the resource we have. And does it even matter as long as we're doing great science? So I've got a provocative question, again from Darren McGarvey, which says, if all the best people are in all the best jobs, then why is Britain such a bin fire? So he's talking about politics. I'm not saying the Crick is a bin fire. I'm not saying UK research as a sector is a bin fire, but I'm saying we need to listen for the smoke alarms, is what I'm saying. So I would say we do recruit the best, but we recruit the best within a small pool that we fish in, which is as much selected by class and financial privilege as it is by intellectual aptitude, for all these obvious reasons that I've talked about for the past hour. We lose talent through the career stage because people can't afford to hang on trying to make it to the top. We don't even consider talent in the first place because they just didn't have the polish, and I just couldn't imagine them interacting with the scientists at that level, kind of thing. And I think bigger picture, I'm quite concerned, as many are, by this growing distrust between elite academia, people who have postgraduate degrees and live in places like London and Edinburgh and Cambridge, and the wider public. So I'm really sorry to bring up the B word because no one likes going over it again. But I remember when Brexit happened, I voted Remain, I campaigned, I was distressed, but I also remember a lot of nastiness on social media. I remember seeing comments and articles that were basically along the line of, if not in these exact words, like, great, thick chavs voted for Brexit, look at what they've done to us. And again, I remember my friend from the working class background responding to something that had happened. She said, to be honest, when I see stuff like this, it almost makes me glad that Leave won. There, I said it. And so I get where she's coming from. And I think we need to think about this gap. We're clever, we know, and we're telling you, but your kids can't get jobs here. Okay. I want to talk a bit about class at the Crick. And as I said, a lot of this is assumed and implicit. And so basically we do not measure this and we don't have any data. So I can't say anything explicit. The closest proxy might be university institution, which is not a direct measure. We're introducing those Social Mobility Commission questions in our PhD recruitment this autumn. And when we're thinking about the PhD programme, we don't list the masters as essential, and yet most of the intake do have a master's. So that's something to consider. This is the most significant data set I could speak to you about with knowledge and confidence. So I looked at, when I joined the Crick, our summer undergraduate programme, where we'd recruited top undergrads across the UK. If you look at the blue, these are students who were at UCL, King's, Imperial, Oxford or Cambridge, and that's the application rate, so less than half came from those degrees. The orange ones come from other elite universities, Russell Group, but not those 5, and the grey ones come from the other 136 around the country. And just look at what happens to the people who actually came on the programme, so it almost doubles, and you can see how much the Crick loves OxBridge, just for that summer placement. So I don't know if it's the same at PhD postdoc group leader, but it'd be interesting to know. Some things that we already do, we have our school's work programme. We have the summer undergraduate interns programme that we have changed. We've added accommodation bursary to it, which is really important. We've added these criteria. Okay, there's a lot more we could do. We could offer more paid experience access beyond just 2 months in the summer. We could, why not, blind the institutions that people went to. We could do more outreach. We could consider contextual admissions. We could go mad and do a lottery, like filter out everyone who's, just get down to the good ones and then offer the interviews at random. And I just want to conclude on what you can do. So you can start by reflecting and learning more. And you might reflect on where you've been privileged and advantaged or not, because I'm not assuming we all have. If you're in any kind of position of power, and we are all in an elite privileged organisation, how can you help beyond just your own kids, your own nephew and your friends' kids? Can you proactively sponsor people? Can you ask challenging questions in meetings and committees? Can you work with the people team to de-bias recruitment? So I'm going to finish now, and I want to say a big thank you to my friends and colleagues and students at UCL over the years from working class backgrounds who've shared their life experiences with me. I recommend you watch Sophie Pender's talk. I advise you to attend Jason Arday's talk in November. He's a sociologist of education from Cambridge. And these are 3 books that I strongly recommend if you want to learn more about class in Britain. And that's it.